Hi, everyone. Welcome to Defining Health, Wealth, and Wellness. My name is Ellen Huang. I am the Program Director in Philadelphia for the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. We just heard about holistic real estate development from Dr. Caldwell, and I'll be moderating this next panel where we'll dive deeper into the three facets of holistic real estate development that Dr. Caldwell outlined, which are health, wealth, and wellness, and how they're influenced by the built environment. For this discussion, I'm joined by Dr. Anabelle Morales Droz, a globally recognized pathogenic microbiologist, food research scientist, biochemist, and food safety expert, along with Dominique Casimir, the Enterprise Vice President of Real Estate for Thomas Jefferson University and Health System, and Samantha Porter, the Community Engagement Advisor and Outreach Manager for the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. I did want to just make a quick note that Dominique is having a little bit of technical difficulty, but she'll hop right in when she's able to. But hello, Dr. Morales and Samantha. Good morning. We have so much to discuss in this quick hour, but why don't we start with a round of quick introductions? I did see that there are some students from Camden joining, as well as some folks who are not from Philadelphia. So I thought it'd be good, one, if we could start first with Samantha. If you could tell us just a little bit about what you do and also your connection to Philadelphia.
Thanks, Ellen, and thanks everyone for having me today. I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Samantha Porter, and I am as Ellen said, the Community Engagement Advisor and Outreach Manager at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the Federal Reserve Bank, in addition to our role in setting monetary policy and thinking about our mandate around full employment, we have a very robust group of people who work on community outreach, and I'm one of the members of that team. I'm so grateful. The work that I get to do is really work with researchers who are doing all kinds of very interesting work and meet with our stakeholders to build out really robust engagement and outreach to hear about trends that are happening as it relates to our economy, specifically focused on the needs of those in low to moderate income communities. My connection to Philadelphia is one that's very deep. My family is from Philadelphia, although I grew up elsewhere, and then I came to Temple University and immediately stepped into North Philadelphia and felt the vibrancy of the city and the diversity of the university. And I knew that this was going to be my home too. So my grandparents owned their home in West Philadelphia, both sets of grandparents, and my parents grew up here, both graduated from Overbrook. So I feel very connected to West Philadelphia and the Philadelphia community.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Morales, could you tell us a little bit about what you do and your connection to Philadelphia?
Absolutely. Good morning, and thank you so much for having me this morning. So I am the President and Chief Science Officer for Fusion Farms. Fusion Farms is at the forefront of control agriculture, in control environment, agriculture, and innovation in ag tech. We serve communities that are underserved. We build farms that are in locations where it is very difficult to produce fresh fruits and vegetables in an outdoor, regular field type of agriculture. My connections to Philadelphia are threefold. The first one is a cultural connection. I happen to be born and raised in Puerto Rico, and the city of Philadelphia has the second largest population of Puerto Ricans in the United States. So statistically speaking, it's not that unusual that I ended up in the city of Philadelphia. So that's my first connection with the city of Philadelphia. My second connection, it has to do with being a food scientist and what brought me to the Philadelphia region in the first place. And that is my work with the United States Department of Agriculture, located adjacent to the city of Philadelphia in Winmore in the Chestnut Hill area. And it was there as a senior scientist for the USDA that I had my first exposure to what it's like to work in the city of Philadelphia, spending time in the neighborhood of Kensington, reaching out to schools and middle schools that had disadvantaged students, and sharing with them the possibility of pursuing a career in science, specifically food science. So I enjoyed my time doing that for many years in the city of Philadelphia. Beyond that, the third connection to the city of Philadelphia that I have is that in my capacity as a long distance runner, I ran my very first marathon in the city of Philadelphia. It was a Philadelphia Marathon, and that was in 2006. Since then, I have done many, many races in the city of Philadelphia, and that has to do with what we're going to be talking about today, physical activity and movement. In my case, happens to be running. My favorite race in the city of Philadelphia is a Broad Street Run. I've done it more than 14 times. So I can say that I probably know the city of Philadelphia better by foot than by car.
Awesome, and such a good segue too, because you're touching on the thing that you are running on, which is our city's infrastructure and our built environment, and how you experience health in Philadelphia. I want to start with Samantha. If you could kind of give us a little bit of baseline for our conversation. Infrastructure and housing are such important factors when it comes to health, wealth, and wellness, and how our communities experience those different things. Samantha, could you tell us just a little bit more about what types of disparities exist in our city related to health, wealth, and wellness and our built environment?
Thanks, Ellen. And before I get started with just responding to that question, I have to offer, as always, my Federal Reserve disclaimer that the views I express here are mine alone, and they do not necessarily represent those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. And so now that we've covered that, I want to zoom out a little bit to answer that question, because the first time my entry point into community development was really through the work in New Jersey with disaster recovery. And that was the first time that I was able to really clearly see the impact of our infrastructure, the quality of our infrastructure. This would be our roads and our schools and our bridges and the utilities, utilities in a community, in a neighborhood, and the housing and the quality of housing and people's ability to maintain that housing, people's ability to invest in improvements in that housing. And so right in that role, I really saw that there was a really clear intersection, because both things were destroyed at the same time in the case of disaster recovery. And so then when you think about building it back, there's what the individual is responsible for and able to access, so their individual property and their access to various types of credit, and that will then determine what level of quality they're going to have, the value of that home. And then there's what the government and other private sector nonprofit actors take responsibility for, specifically around roads and utilities. Those were some of the top things that we had to think about, and how that affects then jobs and the supply chain and other issues. So that was really a global view for me around that intersection between infrastructure and housing. So then when I came to Philadelphia and started to focus on first West Philadelphia in the Promise Zone, I joined a housing committee that was already very active, and they were working on a comprehensive housing plan. And by comprehensive, it wasn't just about the types of housing, renters versus homeowners, multifamily, but it was also thinking about who owns the land, what are the zoning issues related to that, how is that then impacting what infrastructure we could build in those neighborhoods and communities. Who owns the land also determines the affordability of building out that infrastructure. So these are just some of the ways in which I was able to get a clearer view. In Philadelphia, we definitely know, and I'll use the Promise Zone again as an example, there are about 7 neighborhoods and several census tracts in those neighborhoods where the home values are lower than the average across Philadelphia. This is a community that was historically redlined, and therefore it's predominantly a Black community. It is a community where we've seen much more difficulty around access to loans for home repair to maintain a certain quality of those homes, even though we see high rates of home ownership. And then you see, as far as from an infrastructure perspective, that there's many school buildings, many roads that had deferred maintenance. You see also the transit access, so bus routes and other things that would help people get access to jobs, and some of those jobs are in quite close proximity, are also, you see the disparities in that community as well. And so that's just one example of how Philadelphia really has a tale of kind of 2 experiences, if you will, in certain areas of the city, where some people have really strong infrastructure and others there's really a need for some investment.
Thank you so much. And I see that Dominique just joined. We're so glad you were able to make it. I did tell folks that you were having technical difficulties, so no worries. We all get it.
About that. I couldn't believe my computer shut down to do an update. I'm so sorry.
It's all good. We're so glad to have you. I did have Dr. Morales and Samantha do a quick introduction to themselves and their connection to Philadelphia. Before I just go into the next question, which is for you, do you mind giving us a quick introduction on yourself?
Sure. My current role right now is the Vice President of Real Estate at Jefferson University and Hospital System. And what that means is I cover everything from hospitals, life science development to campuses. And so when we look at our asset portfolio of approximately close to 600 buildings and the developments that we've done quite significant developments in communities at large and all different types. You know, we range in 10 different counties in 2 different states. And so we cover a large breadth of communities that we activate and access, as well as different types of groups and different ways in which we look at community access. My background is much more in depth. I've had time at the city. I've had time in commercial real estate development, and I've also had time in nonprofit development as well. So that gives a little bit more of my background. My connection to Philadelphia is the one and only Temple University. I came here, I'm not going to state what year, but early 90s. And I've made a home here ever since. And I've had a love affair with Philadelphia ever since. It's one of my favorite cities in the world.
Dominique, you and I share a very similar story. And I'm also a Temple alum, and there's a lot of Temple love before we all hopped onto this live panel. Well, Dominique, thanks so much for your introduction. The next question is for you, and I'd love to know, just building off of what Samantha was sharing around the built environment, how that looks different from different areas. From your experience, how might we think about some of the differences that communities face in various different zip codes, different parts of our city? And from your vantage point, because you have so much experience in the real estate development space, can real estate actually be a part of the solution? Dr. Caldwell in his keynote was talking about real estate as a tool, and it's important to think about how we use them. And so I just want to kind of tie those pieces together and hear from your perspective, like, what can real estate actually do as part of the solution around some of the disparities that folks experience in our city because of the built environment?
Well, I think most people forget that real estate is home, and it's what defines communities. And I think we put so many taglines as to what a home is versus what a community is versus what real estate developers do. And I think it's all synonymous. And I think from a standpoint of different communities and different needs, yes, there's definitely different communities with different needs, but a lot of the problems that we see sometimes in developments is that a lot of the people that are in need are not at the table. And there's ideas from the outside community that come in regards to, this is what I think is needed here, versus asking, what are the solutions that are not working and how can we improve them so that this community can thrive better? And I think from looking at it from a different lens, from various aspects, you know, you look at triple and sometimes a quadruple bottom line in regards to people, place, planet, and profit. But, you know, I think what's really important is, what are we seeking? And what are the outputs that we're looking for in regards to development? So for example, for Jefferson, you know, we're looking at health in a different model. Instead of a sick care model, how do we do a well-being model from where you are? And we're looking at redesigning what healthcare facilities look like so that it's not, I go there when I'm sick. Why don't I go there when I'm healthy to understand how my body can perform better? What does wellness really mean? What are some resources and tools that I can go and utilize? Almost like a library without it being intimidating, where I feel like it's a place where I can ask questions and not feel as though my body's shutting down or I'm being attacked or that people are speaking another language to me. And so in doing that model, in redesigning what we look like in communities, we have a group dedicated. I have to give love to the what we call PJ, or Philadelphia Collaboration of Health Equity, where it starts at the grassroots level with the people in the community designing the facility. So it's not us saying, this is our brand, this is how we're coming to you, we're a hospital system, this is how you have to accept us. We're now looking at, no, what do you want in your community? How do you want it to feel? How would you feel welcome? Where's a resource where you can understand more about how your body functions and the type of questions you want answered? And so we're looking at how we address needs in a completely different, holistic manner than imposing our view of what that should look like in a community. And different communities need different things. So one size does not fit all, and we have to understand that. And so what we see from a retail perspective is, this is the model, this is how it needs to fit. And I'm going to replicate this in every place I go. And what we're learning is that one model does not fit all. And sometimes you have to customize and adjust as needed, because different communities need different things. And so that's what we're learning. And I think that's something that could be spread amongst the development community in regards to a modeling tool, flexibility. I think one thing that we've learned through this whole entire pandemic is nothing is certain and everything needs to be flexible. And that includes design and approach. And that's one of the key tools or takeaways that I would lend to from that perspective.
Nothing. I want to just be able to think about what you just said around flexibility, and nothing is certain. And I certainly see that, especially over the last 2 years, that we've all been navigating that uncertainty. And it's interesting to think about how such a large institution like Jefferson, you said 600 facilities that you're overseeing. That's a lot of buildings and a lot of places where you are, and thinking about how to build flexibility into that. I'd love to take it over to Dr. Morales and continue on this thread around the built environment. Samantha laid out for us the disparities across different zip codes, different areas, and what that means in terms of the home values and things like that. And Dominique just shared a little bit about what that looks like and what development could look differently if we think about it from well-being. And Dr. Morales, I understand that you are looking at food and you're looking at the way people are nourished and where people can have access to nourishment. How do you see the built environment from your work? Is it green spaces? Is it sidewalks? Is it healthy food options? How do you see the built environment?
Yeah, absolutely. All of it in terms of everything that you just mentioned. But I'm going to focus on two particular items, and that has to do first with nutrition, with food. We all have to eat, right? It's what drives our level of health, right? How you feed yourself, how do you fuel yourself? And to follow up with what Samantha or Dominique was just talking about, what we've learned in the past 2 years during the pandemic is a greater awareness that the food that we eat not only nourishes us, but can also protect us. So in terms of the types of foods that we have access to, it makes a big difference in terms of our overall health. And the second point that I wanted to emphasize is the one about physical activity and movement, right? And that has to do with the infrastructure and the spaces that people have available to be able to move, to exercise, to create community, to gather in groups, and so on. But let's revisit the nutrition part of it and the food production. And when you look at what the problem that we have is a broken food system, the way in which we grow food, the way in which we distribute food locally and globally. So what are some of the ways in which we can improve the ways in which we're growing, especially fresh fruits and vegetables? Because food miles matter. The distance from where the food is produced to where the food is actually consumed has a direct impact in terms of the nutritional value. So when you're thinking about, food deserts and urban farming and urban needs to feed a population, which by the way, it's projected to be 2.5 billion people living in urban settings by the year 2050, we see a disconnect. The disconnect between the way in which we grow food and the number of people that we have to be able to feed by the year 2050, which is a population of 10 billion people on the planet. So how do we do that? How do we do that when 70% of all agricultural land, it's already being used. So horizontally, we can't grow anymore, right? So when you look at a city, you have very limited space in terms of places where you can grow food. So one of the agricultural solutions is to look at vertical farming. That is, instead of growing horizontally, we're going to grow vertically, which is exactly what we are doing. And we're growing an enormous amount of food in a very small space. Beyond that, we're also looking at the real estate and in those opportunity zones, utilizing buildings that have been abandoned or are no longer in use. And we are revitalizing those spaces and repurposing those buildings to create places where we can have at scale a great production of fresh fruits and vegetables. So that's the food portion of it. And again, in terms of the exercise availability to spaces, whether they're, you can start out with indoor spaces, like in gyms, for example, but also looking at outdoor spaces that are available, paths, whether we're talking about, for hiking, for running, for walking, accessibility to those spaces, recreational parks where young people and adults can gather and can be physically active. Is about movement. So those two key areas are critical to health. Beyond that, I wanted to add one more thing, and it has to do with restoring, right? Restoring sleep and stress management. And the way that you can do that is by having enough, sleep and rest, and having a infrastructure that allows for that sort of, quiet and distance so that you can actually rest. So taking that into consideration when we're building infrastructure in a city is also critical to overall health.
Awesome. Well, we've been talking a lot about wellness and health, but we haven't touched very deeply on the topic of wealth. And I'm curious, Dr. Morales, as you're talking about repurposing buildings, thinking about urban cities and how they'll develop, who has access to the types of food that you're describing and who doesn't, who overtly has demand for it and who doesn't. I'm curious to know, how does the element of wealth show up in your work or into some of your thinking around the work that you do?
Yes. So I'm going to give you two different angles. The first one is that I like to define health as wealth, right? So the wealth that comes from being healthy, from having a high quality of life, is incredibly critical to acquiring health and from living a life that has a high quality of living, right? Beyond that, the investments that we make, especially in low income communities, to build these farms that then produce large amounts of food, creates thousands of jobs, right? So the economic development of areas that have not had that opportunity, because agriculture has not been in the past part of an urban setting, that in itself provides the opportunity for wealth, right? So the investment in, developing these buildings and revitalizing and repurposing these buildings opens up a whole economy, right? That a business model that can be very, very profitable. Because when you think of it, what we're doing, we have very, very few inputs in terms of what the raw resources that we use, and we have lots and lots of outputs. So the ability to generate quite a few profits, for the community, in the community, by providing the jobs and providing the food at an affordable price and high quality food that is nutritional dense, it's incredibly important. So that, in a nutshell, to sort of make the connection between those two and how one defines the other. So health and wellness are true, wealth.
Samantha or Dominique, do you have any additional thoughts on this element of wealth? I love the kind of intersectionality that Dr. Morales is illustrating.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I'm sure Samantha has a great insight from her lens. But I don't think people think about it too much from a hospital perspective or an academic perspective. And, I was saying we're going from a sick care centric to a health assurance centric model. And I think, to your point, Dr. Morales, everybody can identify with wealth through healthiness. And, as being as an academic institution as well, the resources in regards to having access to be able to make the investments into yourself in regards to education, furthering education, and every class is not for pay. We have plenty of free resources for the community to tap into. But I think one of the things that we recognize with our most recent merger with Einstein, especially in the Philadelphia corridor where it hits, a community in need, we're looking at how we can further develop and, invest into a point where people feel as though resources are there that are needed to them, to be able to tap into wealth. Sometimes it's just being able to have access to resources and tools to be able to invest more into yourself to grow that wealth, and understanding what and how you define wealth. And so I think wealth can mean a lot of different ways, but also we're pouring into communities of need at a higher ratio than we've ever had before, and also opening up wealth from a different perspective. And I'm going to go into our DEI perspective of distributing wealth to small businesses in regards to development opportunities and seeing how they can be a part of our ecosystem as we expand and grow throughout the region as well. So I just want to elaborate a little bit on the different aspects of wealth and how we can incorporate that into our ecosystem.
I'd love to build on a couple of threads that have come up in the conversation as it relates to this, because at the Federal Reserve right now, with my colleagues who are very brilliant, we're thinking very deeply about sort of shifting the conversation from, just addressing Philadelphia's focus on poverty, which is just a measure of income. And I heard, Dr. Morales and Dominique talking about the opportunities for the individual to maybe increase their incomes and therefore, perhaps see some mobility. But there's also this component of like asset development and being able to invest in assets. And to your earlier point about is real estate possibly a tool? It gets very complicated, particularly in communities where we see some of these real disparities. And I'm going to say specifically by race, because when anchor institutions like Thomas Jefferson are investing in communities, property values tend to start to go up, which for our homeowners, that is increasing that asset, the value of that asset. But we also know that there's a broader structural challenge around some of our communities just do not get the home value that's needed for their asset to provide the wealth. So the income can be for the things that they want to acquire, your day-to-day living. I think, Dr. Morales, I really appreciated your point about access to healthy food and being, a whole person. And I think that, wealth is really that piece, that component that creates the next opportunity, the broader opportunity, which is, I want to make an investment in my child's education. Home equity, some of our researchers are focused on home equity being the number one way that families with higher wealth are able to finance that education. Otherwise, it's going to be debt. So you can have a great income, but if you have really high debt, these are some of the challenges. And so when we think about investing in the infrastructure, it is about the access to jobs, and it is about building out, the buildings and people being able to sort of buy into that. Home ownership, for example. But I think we also have to expand the wealth conversation to what is the value of the asset that folks hold, and that it's not, sucking out what they're able to bring home. I think there's an extractive component to wealth building that we have to sort of recognize. We know that there are some areas in Philadelphia where we have very high numbers of folks who they may be homeowners, but they are also leveraging that asset to take care of many people. And so their income could be high and the asset could be owned, but it's still not enough to sort of make the difference around their mobility and other opportunities. And so I just want to expand our view. When we're talking about wealth, we're really talking about, something much more broad than income.
Yeah.
And then how it gets passed down. There's an intergenerational component as well. And I think real estate, most clearly is an example where, we see homes that that we can pass down, or we see inability to pass down those homes, particularly in Black communities in Philadelphia. Tangled title is a major challenge. The Register of Wills right now is trying to pull lawyers to help families to be able to have this asset and leverage it for better outcomes. So I do think that the interplay is complicated, and I'm really glad that we're having this conversation and expanding the discussion to include wealth beyond just income and the sort of traditional poverty alleviation and thinking about this much more broadly.
Samantha, you just mentioned tangled titles. For folks in the audience who may not know what that is, could you just give a quick explanation on tangled titles, and then perhaps expand on the example around why certain types of policy decisions impact the way in which we think about these things?
Yeah, so this would essentially be a situation where the owner of the property may have passed away, close out the estate. There's other issues where there may be liens or other things on a property. That means the title cannot be transferred to another person. So it gets tied up in these sort of legal processes. And there's a number of policies that impact families who have an asset, what the ownership looks like, who would then be the beneficiary of that asset, what is the right process for that person to be able to transfer that, what are the costs associated with it, there's tax implications. So we do have, it's layered, but this would essentially be questions around ownership that have to be cleared up in order for you to transfer property, if I can put it most generally.
And then Ellen, to follow up on the policy standpoint, I don't know if it's more so policy or financial literacy, because it comes down to planning and estate planning and setting up your affairs in the way where it almost seems as though it's been associated with a level of sophistication and financial literacy. And so there's a process that needs to happen from a financial literacy that's tied into public policy. I don't know if there's a policy that would streamline these efforts a little bit better. I mean, that's something where there would have to be a lot of talking heads at the table from a lot of different diverse aspects to really come up with a holistic solution. But this comes into the wealth gap in regards to financial literacy and how generational wealth has not been able to smoothly transition due to entanglement issues or estate planning.
Yeah, good point.
It's as simple as being like ownership. That's the solution, right? There's a lot that surrounds that. There's a lot that comes after ownership as well that needs to be considered. That's really interesting. Is home ownership the goal here then? I mean, I'm kind of hearing like it could be, but it's not necessarily, because there's a lot that surrounds it. And I'm just kind of, I'm interested in thinking about this idea of ownership and the idea of assets being owned and it translating into a benefit. And so, yeah, I'm curious to know from any of your standpoints around like, is owning a home the goal here, or is it something else, and owning a home could be a way to get there?
I'll take a first dive if that's okay. And I'm not sure that I'm going to answer it correctly, but I will say that some people forget that homes can be either an asset or a liability. And so home ownership sounds great, but I think there's a lot of education that needs to go into home ownership. It's not just about simply owning a home, it's also about maintaining the home in a way where it doesn't devalue in a way that you can't maintain home ownership. And it can become a liability if you're not properly investing into the home year after year and in the right way. Is home ownership the goal? I think it depends on the family situation, and it depends on the individual. Is it a good asset? Absolutely. You're always going to need a place to stay. Home ownership is the quickest way to building wealth in America, and it is something that's greatly promoted. But at different stages of life, ownership can mean different things to different people. And, as we're looking at families that are more so aging, where parents are aging and they want to live with their children because of certain situations, home ownership may not be the best ideal state. It may be a co-living situation with other people. So I think that's something that's to be further explored. I think that it's not as simple as saying you should own a home and all of your problems will go away and you're automatically going to have wealth. I think it's a much more layered and in-depth conversation, and at different stages of life and different financial stages of life, home ownership may be ideal or not ideal, but there's different ways to live um, economically sound to your situation where you can yield the highest and best outcome. So I'll stop there. I'm sure Samantha's going to say, no, own a home no matter what.
No, I'm going to take actually a different perspective on that. And I want to definitely create space for Dr. Morales to join into this conversation. But, I think that we've seen a formula around home ownership. And to the earlier conversation around what is the value of investing in infrastructure, the middle class, which is predominantly in suburban areas, there was an investment also in the infrastructure around those homes, and therefore those homes increased in value. And I think that is the structural component. You described some of the individual decision making around that. I think that where you're positioned in your family, if you have to raise a down payment or you're receiving a down payment through some sort of family transfer of funds, that factors in. If you have to go to the conventional mortgage market versus going to perhaps an FHA market or a VA market, that is going to determine how quickly you build equity in that. So then you have these kind of different considerations. And so, is home ownership the goal? I think that what I would love to see for low to moderate income families and Black and Brown communities specifically is a full menu of options. Like, what does it look like, rather than continuing with what we saw building the middle class around home ownership in the suburban context, where there was a lot of infrastructure also built to make that successful. So roads and highways were built so that people could travel, they could own cars, other infrastructure like where schools were built, less crowded schools, ostensibly higher quality. So these are all of the components I think that play into the discussion around, is home ownership the quickest way? I think it's been created that way thus far. I don't know that it necessarily has to be the answer for the wealth generation that we want to imagine in our futures. I want to open it up to others to just react to that.
Dr. Morales, I'm going to give you a chance to.
Yes, so thank you so very much. So my lens is slightly different, and rather than the focus on home ownership, I'd like to help our audience look at this from the perspective of two terms that really are the focus of what we do, and that is food security and food sovereignty. So food security is that concept of having access to the food, availability to healthy food options. Food sovereignty goes to what you guys have been talking about in terms of ownership, right? Owning the food. So who produces the food? Where is that food produced? Who owns and who has access to that wealth in terms of the business end of it, the commercial end of it, right? So how do we set up these businesses in areas of low income areas and make long-term investments, capital in terms of labor and resources that go to these areas to facilitate food security and food sovereignty in urban areas. So my lens is slightly different from what you guys have talked about in terms of just owning the home, but I'm thinking about who owns the business, who owns the ability to grow the food, and does it stay within that space? Is it hyper local, or are you exporting and sending the food elsewhere? And how, if you do that, if you get to the point where you export, where is that economic benefit, benefiting back to that initial community that produced the food? And I also wanted to follow up in a comment that Dominique just made a couple of minutes ago when you talked about financial literacy. And again, looking at things from my lens in terms of the food and the nutrition and the physical activity and the movement and the wellness, it's about education. So it doesn't really matter if people have access to food in terms of physical geographical proximity. It doesn't matter if they have access in terms of affordability, whether the food is at a cost that they can actually afford. But if there's not that education a factor, that literacy in terms of what to eat, how to eat, that is not going to serve, right? It's not going to be a change that is going to have an impact both economically and in terms of health and wellness in that community where the foods are available. So that's another key aspect of discussion that should be, considered as well. The literacy, the education, and what it is that we do in terms of elevating that educational factor, in terms of how do we involve the community, how do we show them how to grow their own food, how to fix and prepare the foods that we're growing, those fruits and vegetables. Are they culturally appropriate for the communities in those urban locations where we're growing the foods?
So I just, Ellen, if I may, Dr. Morales brings up a great point in regards to ownership. And ownership is changing in regards to the younger generation, in regards to what they want to own. So I say that to say what we think of ownership versus what the future generation in 2080, what they'll think of ownership is different. And I could tell you that my kids, who are the next generation, would much rather own food that Dr. Morales is talking about than probably their own home, because they see homes as being transient. Like, oh, I can live wherever I want throughout the world. It's more so about access and opportunity. So this is another generation where they're not tying their futures down for the next 30 years in one location. They're looking at, oh, I'm going to live in this city and that city and this city and that city. And I'm going to be transient because the jobs and the work and the atmosphere is changing to that aspect where you no longer have to be grounded in the traditional aspect. And where they look to own right now are in stocks and businesses. And I think that they care more about the food quality that they have access to and where it's coming from. And you bring up a great point, because ownership models are changing in regards to how we're investing and what we're investing into, whether it's our physical homes or in the structure of businesses that are growing things that we need to be healthy well-beings. And so it's just a very interesting model in regards to how the access to wealth is changing and pivoting, and how the markets will respond and how much flexibility there will be in regards to changing those dynamics and how we associate wealth. So I think it's a very excellent point, Dr. Morales, in regards to different aspects of wealth and ownership.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That's awesome. We have just under 15 minutes left of our panel, and we've each touched a little bit on future thinking around like what would we like to see. And I know a lot of these questions were distilling the opportunity and the challenges that we see related to equitable development and holistic development and health, wealth, and wellness. I'd love to spend the few minutes we have together really thinking about the future and projecting ideas and inspiration around what is the ideal development in our cities. Maybe Dominique, I could maybe start with you, just continuing the thread that you started, is like the future of our cities and the future of what we invest in and what people want to actually have ownership of is going to look very different. And so how can we take some of those thinkings around like different trends that we see, the way the market is, moving? What is the ideal holistic real estate development in your mind in 5-10 years from now?
Well, that's a loaded question. But I will say it's interesting just in the short period of time of how much the market has shifted, even in Philadelphia. What we've seen is an influx of residential markets peaking in regards to transactions. We've also seen almost kind of like a mass exodus of office space not being utilized, but being revitalized by life sciences. So we're seeing a life science sector really flourish and grow, one that we can't even really meet the demands of. So it's very interesting, because where I see developments going in the future is more so around the holistic and well-being of individuals. I think what we've learned through the pandemic is certain things matter. Food matters, to Dr. Morales' point. Access matters.
Yeah.
Well-being matters. Oh, good, Samantha, you're back. So I think what we'll start to see shifts around is not so much buildings and infrastructures, but more so around place and community all being intertwined. The live, work, and play model, I see that expanding in a completely different mindset of what the next generation views play, work, and live versus what previous generations thought of it as. I think we're going to see a lot more green space. I think we're going to see a lot of living downsides because I don't think people want to live in their homes. They want to live outside in their communities and be interactive. I think we're going to see a lot more innovative placemaking, placemaker buildings of innovation where people can really explore their designs and creative thought. I see more of that being in the fabric of our communities and places of health assurance models versus anything else. So that's where I see Philadelphia trending to. In regards to global centers or in general, cities have become sexy and hot. And so we're seeing a mass migration to cities versus rural and suburban areas. So it's how do we redesign that? And even in some of the suburban markets, we see suburban developers mimicking city-like feelings where they're creating these town centers that give that city feeling. So I think we're going to have to really think about what that means for the next couple of generations. But I see models more so of communal living, interactiveness, and things not being so displaced, but more so gathered together. And so I'll stop there and give others an opportunity to respond too.
I love your vision of the future. I want to live in that city, Dominique. The way I see it, let's put it this way. Let's look at the city of Philadelphia today and look at the number of supermarkets that are available in the city, for example. Look at how food is not only available in terms of in limited numbers and resources, but is not available to people who have limited economic access to affordability to be able to afford those foods, right? So the city of the future, what I'd like to see is many of these vertical farms, the controlled environment agriculture in several places throughout the city of Philadelphia. And the way that I see it, and the reason why we need multiple locations is because the focus should be on providing food that is of high quality and that is hyper local. So that means that the food with the highest nutritional content is going to be grown next to or adjacent to the community that is going to be served by that one particular farm. And then think about all the restaurants, think about all the hotels in the city of Philadelphia, and where does the food come from? Where are those leafy greens being grown? Those food miles do matter. So as we look at the future and as we look at sustainable ways of growing food, it has to be hyper local. And in order to be able to meet the demand of 2.5 billion people in urban areas, we need to be able to grow food at a large scale. And that is, vertical farming in controlled environments in which we can optimize all the conditions that we need to produce that food at scale. So that's what I see in the future in the city of Philadelphia. I see many vertical farms all over the city providing food that is affordable, that is highly nutritious to all the residents of the city. That the city of Philadelphia, the restaurants are going to have the access to the best leafy greens that are available because they're produced right in the city of Philadelphia. In addition to that, I also see a future with lots of what Dominique talked about in terms of physical activity, outdoor activities that are possible, especially in ways where are community centered, that these are group runs, group walks, events, races, and physical activity available to everyone, all kinds of movement, whether it's tennis, whether it's, public pools, any kind of movement. And finally, the key piece of education to create awareness of, what it is that it takes to increase your health and wellness. So people have to know, right, how to eat, when to eat, how, what are the better for you choices, right? So education has a key critical role in the success of us being able to build these healthier cities. So anything else that you'd like to add to that?
That's wonderful. Samantha, we're just rounding out this conversation before we close out this hour, sharing with folks your idea of the ideal future development in Philadelphia. What would you like to see? Oh, I think you're muted. That's all right. So this is just the reality of our world today. We have to have a lot of grace and patience with the technology that we have available, and every platform is so different to navigate. Samantha, do you think you'll be able to find your mic, or?
She's working on it.
Yeah.
Samantha, try your upper left.
Yeah, upper left. You might see it. It might be hidden on you, but you should see it where you can mute and unmute, or it might be your physical computer.
Do you want to scroll all the way up on your upper left? If you scroll all the way up.
I love this. Teamwork makes the dream work.
Her voice will be heard. We've had all types of computer. Well, this is the beauty that we've learned how to navigate through. And, this is where we talk about flexibility again, in just being able to go with the punches and understand that technology is great, but, we figure out a way to communicate anyway. And I think a lot of the insight that Samantha provided earlier on just gives us insight in regards to, from wealth, looking at wealth from a different aspect and not the way that we've traditionally viewed it, but, in the multi-layers of, the greater picture of wealth. And, I think I see her working on it. Do you see it?
Yes.
We hear you?
Are you back? So sorry, we can't hear you, Samantha.
Oh no.
Yes.
Yes. Samantha, please share. We want to hear from you.
Thank you. Yes. And I'm going to end on time. I'm going to use these 5 minutes, but when I want to answer the question, and I'm thinking about this audience around what does the future look like, a few things that I think are really promising in Philadelphia around wealth development and more specifically housing is the resident engagement that I'm seeing across the city, making sure that we have the voices of the folks who are impacted at the table to envision this future. It's not fair for, just our decision makers to be at the table. And so when I see the participatory budgeting process that's happening with the city, when I see the bus redesign and the community engagement that's going on there, this is around the investments that we're going to make in the infrastructure that are ultimately going to strengthen our neighborhoods. I also am thinking about just the investment in the quality of our homes. I see developers working on community benefits agreements that are actually able to invest in the capacity of our community members who are living in spaces that need capital, frankly. Thinking about equitable access to capital, I'm seeing the city think about special purpose credit products that help us to get people in mortgages if that's what they choose that they want to pursue in Philadelphia. Also gaining access to loans that help them increase the quality of their homes so that their neighborhoods can be strengthened. And so these are just some of the things that give me an indication of the future where we might have moving that conversation, as I mentioned earlier, from just income and poverty alleviation to really building wealth for Philadelphians who've been here. We are so excited to welcome new folks to Philadelphia and really see our our community grow. But I also want to see opportunity and mobility for the folks who've been in Philadelphia for 40 years while we've had some policies and practices that might have put them in a position where we see some really disproportionate impacts. We see some really disproportionate outcomes. So, when I think about the future in Philadelphia, I see us moving in a direction of having more voices at the table, power with, power together, and being able to make those investments where we can address the structural, not just what's impacting the individual. So I just wanted to be able to share those few thoughts, and I appreciate everyone being patient with me while I figured out the technical difficulties today.
No, you are fine, Samantha. Thank you, Dr. Morales, Dominique, and Samantha for your insights today. I certainly feel like I was taking notes everywhere. And just on the last note, Samantha, you were talking about something that hit home for me and reminds me of something Dr. Caldwell said, which is when people are left out, we lose out. And he made a note about if we want to see Philly really thrive and really grow, we need to make sure we do not leave segments of our community out of that. And I thought that was such a powerful both business case, but also just a good case for who we want to be as Philadelphia, the city. Well, with just about 2 minutes left, thank you everyone who is tuning into this discussion. I saw really awesome chat happening on the side too, so love the activity there. This was a conversation on the holistic real estate development, health, wealth, and wellness. And our next session will probably begin at 11:45, and it takes place back on this main stage. It's titled Overcoming Private and Public Obstacles, and we'll examine common obstacles in holistic real estate development projects and the means by which to overcome them. So lots of solutions and ideas. And this conversation is going to feature council members Curtis Jones Jr., Maria Quinones Sanchez, Ann Nevins, the president of the Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation, and Leslie Smallwood Lewis, the founder of Mosaic Development Partners. And moderating the panel will be Sandra Dungy-Glenn of The Collective. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. Dr. Morales, Dominique, Samantha, thank you so much. I look forward to staying in touch with you all. And for everybody, please tune back in at 11:45 for the next session. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.